This is the Chapel of Anticipation, the starting area in Elden Ring, and it certainly lives up to its name. At a first glance, this place looks very innocent, but it is also home to one of the most ominous sights in Elden Ring. Inside the main room of the chapel lies a dead woman, and if we turn on online mode, we are met with an enormous pool of bloodstains covering the floor beside her. And the story behind these bloodstains are a pretty interesting one. Bloodstains in Elden Ring show you the deaths of other players and usually function as a warning sign that danger is nearby. But if we take a look at the surrounding area, there are no immediate dangers. This place is designed to be a peaceful and quiet beginning where you can grow comfortable with the controls. But seemingly things did not go as planned for these players. What caused these player deaths and why right here? What could possibly be the reason behind this pool of death? I've been looking into these questions for a while, and now that I finally have all the theories and discoveries settled, it's time to tell the story of these bloodstains and Elden Ring's death cult. If we make our way to the bloodstains, we're able to inspect them, and doing so reveals that all the players who died here all died due to the same cause, the Seppuku Ash of War. This Ash of War is an ability that is found very late into the game at the mountaintops of the Giants, and is a very common ability used by players who focus on dealing bleed damage. And just like the samurai ritual itself, by using it, you thrust your weapon into your stomach, inducing some damage to yourself, but in return, increasing your attack power and the rate of your bleed effect buildup. Effectively, if you use this ability multiple times, you eventually die. Evidently, this is what caused the deaths of these players. But what we still do not know is why they did this. And I want to be honest, the answer is not entirely clear. Initially, my theory was that these people are probably starting New Game Plus, grabbing a necessary item, and then choosing to die. Dying in the starting area is a necessary step to progress, so it would be natural for experienced players to immediately try and die as fast as possible to save some time. In short, I thought that these bloodstains were simply the product of experienced players who wanted to skip the tutorial. And I was pretty confident in this hypothesis, so of course I had to try it myself. But then in my test, I realized some things. First, I realized that there's no reason for an experienced player to choose this specific spot for their death. Usually, there's an item here on your initial playthrough. However, in New Game Plus, which is a mode where you begin the game anew after completing it, this item doesn't reappear. Therefore, it wouldn't serve as a draw or incentive for a veteran player to go there prior to performing the Seppuku ability. Secondly, I realized that dying before you enter the boss arena, located later in the starting area, does not let you progress. Instead, you just respawn. Finally, it's somewhat puzzling to consider that all these players would take the time to repeatedly use the Seppuku ability rather than simply opening the door and swiftly leaping off a nearby cliff. Now, even given all these inconsistencies, if we set them aside, only players who focus on causing bleed damage would typically have the Seppuku ability at the ready. This begs the question, are all these players specifically employing bleed-focused damage? A glance at the bloodstains suggests that most of them indeed are. However, there's a smattering of others who appear to be using hybrid strategies, or possibly something completely different. It's impossible to know from our perspective, but what we can conclude is that it's possible that some of these players died here despite not initially having the Seppuku ability equipped. Instead, they either carried a weapon with the Seppuku ability in their inventory, or maybe even arrived from the outside where a grace enabling them to switch abilities is available. It seems there are many unanswered questions with this theory, and for this theory to work, we have to make multiple assumptions. Firstly, we need to assume that the players who died here intended to bypass the game's tutorial, only to discover that it wasn't possible after their attempt. Similarly, we must assume that all these players had convenient access to the Seppuku Ash of War, and that in their collective judgment, repeatedly using the Seppuku ability was a quicker alternative to jumping off the nearby cliff. These assumptions assume a lot, but could potentially support this theory. But even with these considerations, we are still unable to discern why these players chose this specific spot. There's no real incentive for a New Game Plus player to use seppuku here rather than any other location inside this room. If we want to explain the choice of this spot rather than any other spot, we need another theory. And after some more thinking, I came up with one. The Bloodstains are all from experienced players, but they are not necessarily starting New Game Plus. Instead, the players are going to the starting area through a portal found later in the game, and then choose to die here by the Maiden. But why would they do this? In my opinion, I find it plausible that someone would do this simply for the reason that the Bloodstain would put a new player on edge and scare them. This could be a very plausible explanation. It's not unlike the Souls community to poke some playful fun at inexperienced players. This is seen in many other places in the game. This theory would also explain the location of the Bloodstains. When players use the seppuku ability here, they make sure a newcomer can't miss it. After all, there is a necessary item here, which is sure to attract the attention of new players. While this theory is plausible, it does assume there's an unspoken collaboration between players to troll newcomers by committing seppuku in this exact spot. And that to me does sound kind of far-fetched. And so I did some more digging, this time on the internet to try and find a trace of this collaboration. And to my surprise, I found that many other players had asked my exact question. Multiple different forums were all confused by the same collection of bloodstains and had asked about their existence. So what were the replies to these questions? Well, they were kind of conflicting. Some people proposed that players had left the bloodstains here to decorate and create a story around this maiden's death. It's thought that she was once an important person to our main character, especially given the message that she left for us, and thus dying here is a way to honor her. But another chunk of players had another explanation, an explanation more sinister and chilling. They whispered of a cult, a tradition stemming from Dark Souls 2, a past game from the same studio. Supposedly, this tradition was known among the participants as the Majula Death Cult, an in-game suicide pact. According to these players, these bloodstains in the chapel are a continuation of this exact pact that started all the way back in Dark Souls 2. The nature of this pact is very informal, and there are no verbal or written agreements between the players. Seemingly, it's as if it simply just sort of happened, and the tradition has carried on from Dark Souls 2 through most other From Software games, all the way to Elden Ring. But what exactly is the purpose of the pact? Well, let's figure it out by examining the place where the pact was born. Majula is the player hub in Dark Souls 2, and is located very early in the game, right after the tutorial area. And it's in the passage between the tutorial area and Majula where the pact initially was performed. Here we find another huge collection of bloodstains that all show that the players who died here died to an animation much like the seppuku animation in Elden Ring. Bloodstains in Dark Souls 2 function pretty much the same as in Elden Ring. They signal danger, but again, there are no immediate dangers in the area. To me, it seems like the purpose of the pact is to again frighten new players by putting them on edge with a huge collection of bloodstains. And it seems I agree with a lot of the people from these online forums. But in my opinion, there also exists another purpose. Since the item that is required to be able to do this is found very late into the game, you can kind of infer that these players are likely to have finished the game. Therefore, this collection of bloodstains can also be seen as a mass of players who've come together to celebrate each other and their victories in the game. Personally, I find this whole explanation to be kind of incredible. I've always known that the Souls community was a dedicated and tight-knit community, but this supposed tradition that started from nothing in 2014 and is still going strong today is a great testament to how devoted and passionate the Souls community really is, and how much camaraderie they show each other. However, in my personal opinion, it's not entirely possible to know if this explanation, this notion of the Majula Death Cult, is solely responsible for the mysterious pool of bloodstains. I have to acknowledge that the theory of players leaving bloodstains to decorate the area and create a story around the maiden's death also carries a bit of weight. Honestly, it could be a blend of both of these theories. However, given the Majula Death Cult's prevalence throughout multiple games and the numerous discussions about it on online forums, it seems highly likely that this player-driven pact is indeed the main perpetrator of this pool of bloodstains. At the same time, this phenomenon aligns quite well with my own theory, so in many ways I find myself inclined to believe in this explanation. But in the end, it seems like we will never know with absolute certainty. But isn't that kind of fitting? Elden Ring's design often leaves its story and world intentionally ambiguous, open to our interpretation and imagination. In that spirit, I find it wonderfully fitting that we can't pin down a definitive answer. Is this the lone work of the Majula Death Cult? Or has this pool of blood been helped by player-driven decoration of the Maiden's death? Seemingly, we will never know. So where do we go from here? What now? While the Majula Death Cult might not be an organized group with leaders and official members, it's a tradition that has been passed down through the Souls games, and now to Elden Ring. Its existence depends entirely on us, the players, continuing to uphold it. So next time you wander into the Chapel of Anticipation, I invite you to leave your mark, contribute to the pool of blood, celebrate that you've completed the game, frighten the new players, and keep the tradition alive.